They called humans the soft ones across the galaxy, a species so fragile that a single breath of methane could kill them, so weak that they needed mechanical suits just to survive on most worlds. The Zephyrian Empire had conquered 17 star systems without losing a single warrior, their impenetrable armor making them legends of invincibility. But, legends, as Captain Marcus Chen would soon discover, have a way of crumbling under the gentlest touch. When the first human colony ship limped into Zephyrian space, damaged and desperate, it seemed like just another species begging for mercy. What the Empire didn't expect was that sometimes the greatest weapon isn't strength, it's knowing exactly where to apply the smallest amount of force. This is the story of how humanity's greatest weakness became the galaxy's most feared strength, and why across 1,000 worlds, warriors still whisper the tale of the day when a light touch was enough to bring down an empire. The emergency beacon cut through the void like a dying scream, its distress signal bouncing off asteroids and debris in the outer rim of the Kepler 442 system. Commander HFY Thornscale adjusted his targeting display with one massive claw, the motion causing his ceremonial armor plates to scrape against each other with a sound like grinding stone. At 8 feet tall and built like a living tank, the Zephyrian warrior was an imposing sight even by his species standards. "Unknown vessel, you have entered sovereign Zephyrian space without authorization," his voice rumbled through the communication array, each word carrying the weight of absolute authority. "State your business or prepare to be destroyed." The response came through crackling static, weak and desperate. "This is Captain Marcus Chen of the human colony ship New Horizon. We're experiencing critical system failures and requesting emergency assistance. We have non-combatants aboard, including children." HFY's second-in-command, Lieutenant Kreshtar, let out what passed for laughter among their kind, a grinding sound like rocks tumbling down a mountainside. "Humans," he spat, his forked tongue tasting the air with disgust. "The soft-skinned weaklings from the outer spiral. I've heard they can't even survive in real atmosphere." The bridge of the Zephyrian dreadnought Iron Sovereign buzzed with dark amusement. These humans were already legendary among the Zephyrian military, though not for any admirable reasons. Intelligence reports painted them as a pathetically fragile species that required elaborate life support systems just to function outside their homeworld. They were mammals, soft, weak creatures that gave birth to live young and actually fed them with their own body fluids. The very concept disgusted most Zephyrians, who hatched from eggs already armored and ready for battle. "Sir, I'm detecting massive hull breaches on the human vessel," reported sensor operator Thaxnil from his station. "Their ship is barely holding together. It's a miracle they made it this far." HFY studied the tactical display, watching as the human ship limped toward them like a wounded animal. The vessel was unlike anything in their databases, sleek where Zephyrian ships were angular, smooth where theirs were armored. It looked fragile, almost delicate, like something that would shatter at the first sign of combat. "Commander," the human voice crackled again, weaker now. "Please, we don't have much time. Our life support systems are failing." The Zephyrian commander considered his options. Standing orders were clear: unknown vessels in Zephyrian space were to be destroyed without question. The Empire had not grown to span 17 star systems by showing mercy to every pathetic species that wandered into their territory. Yet something about this situation intrigued him. These humans had somehow managed to achieve faster-than-light travel, despite their obvious physical limitations. Their technology might prove useful. "You will dock with our ship," HFY finally commanded. "Any hostile action will result in your immediate destruction. You have 10 standard minutes to comply." "Thank you, Commander. We're powering down all weapons and opening our docking bay." Kreshtar leaned closer to his superior, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Sir, surely you don't intend to actually help these creatures? They're clearly inferior, unworthy of our attention." HFY's eyes narrowed, their golden irises glowing with predatory interest. "I intend to study them, Lieutenant. Know your enemy, as the ancient codes teach us. Besides," he added with a cruel smile that revealed rows of razor-sharp teeth, "it might prove entertaining." The docking process took nearly 20 minutes longer than it should have. The human ship's systems were so damaged that their automated guidance systems kept failing, forcing them to dock manually with shaking hands and obvious desperation. When the airlocks finally sealed and atmosphere equalized, HFY led a full squad of his best warriors to greet their guests. The first thing that struck him was the smell. Instead of the clean, metallic scent of proper technology, the human ship reeked of organic compounds, sweat, fear, and other biological odors that made his sensitive nostrils flare with disgust. The corridors were narrow and cramped, clearly designed for creatures much smaller than his mighty frame. He had to duck his head and angle his shoulders just to move through their pathetic excuse for a starship. Captain Marcus Chen was waiting in the main corridor, flanked by two other humans. Vexai was shocked by how small they were. The tallest barely reached his chest, and they looked so fragile that he wondered if he could accidentally crush them just by gripping their hands too firmly. Their skin was smooth and pink, completely unprotected by natural armor or scales. Their eyes were small and weak-looking, set in faces that couldn't hide their emotions even if they tried. But what truly astounded him was their complete lack of proper defensive equipment. These humans wore nothing but thin fabric coverings and basic environmental suits. No armor plating, no redundant life support systems, no weapons integration, nothing that any sensible species would consider essential for survival in hostile space. "Commander Vexai, I presume?" Chen stepped forward, extending his hand in what Vexai recognized as some sort of primitive greeting ritual. "I can't express how grateful we are for your assistance." The Zephyrian warrior stared down at the offered appendage with fascination and disgust. The human's hand was so small, so delicate, with soft flesh covering fragile-looking bones. No claws, no protective scales, no visible defensive modifications at all. He could probably snap every bone in that hand without even trying. "You are smaller than I expected," Vexai rumbled, ignoring the gesture entirely. "Our intelligence reports suggested your species was at least marginally competent. This is disappointing." If Chen was offended by the insult, he didn't show it. Instead, he simply lowered his hand and maintained what appeared to be a genuine smile. "We may not be the strongest species in the galaxy, Commander, but we've learned to make do with what we have." "Indeed." Vexai began walking, forcing the humans to hurry alongside him just to keep up with his massive stride. "Tell me, Captain, how exactly did such a limited species manage to develop interstellar travel? Your vessel's technology appears surprisingly sophisticated for creatures so obviously primitive." Chen's two companions, a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Williams and a man called Chief Engineer Rodriguez, exchanged glances that Vexai's enhanced vision easily caught. There was something they weren't saying, some secret they were keeping. "Interesting. We've always been good at solving problems," Chen replied carefully. "When you can't overpower something, you have to outthink it." "Outthink it," Vexai repeated, tasting the foreign concept. "An amusing notion. In our experience, sufficient force renders thinking unnecessary." They toured the human ship for the next hour, and, with every step, Vexai became more convinced that these creatures were indeed as pathetic as their reputation suggested. Their medical bay was filled with injured crew members who looked ready to die from wounds that wouldn't even slow down a Zephyrian hatchling. Their weapons were laughably primitive chemical projectiles and crude energy dischargers that probably couldn't penetrate basic ceremonial armor, let alone military-grade plating. Most amusing of all was their engineering section, where Rodriguez proudly explained their revolutionary faster-than-light drive. The technology was elegant, Vexai had to admit, but it was also incredibly fragile. Every component was built to the absolute minimum specifications necessary for function, with no redundancy, no over-engineering, no consideration for battle damage. It was the kind of delicate machinery that only a species with no concept of real warfare would design. "Fascinating," Vexai mused as they completed their tour. "Your technology is certainly unique. Tell me, how do you expect to survive in a galaxy filled with species far stronger than yourselves?" Chen's smile never wavered. "The same way we've survived everything else, Commander. By adapting." Adaptation. Vexai rolled the word around in his mouth like he was tasting something foreign. "You speak as if weakness could somehow become strength." "Sometimes it can," Dr. Williams interjected quietly. "Sometimes being small means you can fit through spaces others can't. Sometimes being quiet means you can hear things others miss. Sometimes being gentle means you can touch things that would break under a heavier hand." The Zephyrian commander found himself genuinely intrigued by these strange creatures. Their philosophy was completely alien to everything he understood about survival and conquest, yet they had somehow managed to cross interstellar space and survive contact with the mighty Zephyrian Empire. Perhaps there was more to them than met the eye. You will remain aboard my vessel while repairs are made to your ship, he decided. Consider yourselves guests of the Empire. You will be provided with quarters and sustenance appropriate to your unique needs. That's very generous, Commander, Chen replied. Is there anything we can do to repay your kindness? Vexai's smile was all teeth and predatory satisfaction. Oh, I'm certain we'll think of something. After all, it's not often we have the opportunity to study such an interesting species up close. As the humans were escorted to their temporary quarters, Vexai couldn't shake the feeling that there was something important he was missing. These creatures were clearly as weak and primitive as their reputation suggested, yet they had achieved something that even some of the Empire's client species had failed to accomplish. They had built ships that could cross the void between stars, developed technology that worked despite being built by hands that had never known the strength of proper scales or claws. Perhaps, the commander mused as he returned to his bridge, there was more than one way to measure strength. He would learn soon enough that some measurements were more dangerous than others. The New Horizon hung in the docking bay like a broken bird, its hull scarred and atmosphere bleeding from a dozen different breaches. To Zephyrian eyes, it looked like something that should never have been able to fly, let alone cross the vast emptiness between stars. Yet here it was, and here were its creators, small, soft creatures who somehow thought they could survive in a universe that had already proven how little it cared about their continued existence. Vexai stood before the main view screen in his ready room, studying the tactical analysis his crew had prepared on their unexpected guests. The data was both enlightening and concerning. While the humans were indeed physically inferior in every measurable way, their technology showed signs of sophisticated engineering principles that even Zephyrian scientists might find challenging to reverse engineer. Sir, Lieutenant Kreshtar entered without ceremony, as was his right as second in command. The human ship's repairs will take at least 72 standard hours. Our engineering teams report that their technology is unusual. Unusual how? It's incredibly efficient, sir. Where we would use brute force approaches, they seem to have found ways to accomplish the same goals using a fraction of the power and materials. It's almost like they've been forced to develop these methods out of necessity. Vexai turned from the view screen, his massive frame casting long shadows across the room. Forced by what? Resource scarcity, most likely. Their homeworld appears to have limited heavy metals and energy sources. They've learned to do more with less because they had no choice. Interesting. The commander's claws tapped against his armored forearm, a nervous habit he'd never quite managed to break. And what of the humans themselves? Have our medical teams learned anything useful? Kreshtar's expression grew more animated, the way it always did when he had particularly interesting information to share. They're even more fragile than we initially thought, sir. Their bones are hollow in places, their skin offers virtually no protection against environmental hazards, and their internal organs are positioned in ways that leave them vulnerable to even minor impacts. Yet they survived the journey here. Yes, sir. That's what makes them so puzzling. By all rights, they should have died long before reaching our space. Their ship's life support systems are incredibly sophisticated, they've had to develop technology that can keep them alive in environments that would kill them in seconds. Vexai found himself genuinely curious about these contradictions. How could a species so obviously weak have developed technology so obviously advanced? What kind of evolutionary pressure could have produced creatures who were simultaneously brilliant and helpless? A soft chime from his communication console interrupted his thoughts. Commander, came the voice of his communications officer, the human captain is requesting permission to speak with you privately. Send him to my ready room. Captain Chen arrived a few minutes later, escorted by two guards who towered over him like mountains over a pebble. The human looked even smaller in the vast spaces of the Zephyrian ship, his simple clothing making him appear almost childlike compared to the armored warriors around him. Thank you for agreeing to see me, Commander, Chen said once they were alone. I wanted to discuss the terms of our arrangement. Terms? Vexai's voice carried a note of amusement. You seem to be under the impression that you're in a position to negotiate. Not negotiate, exactly. More like, clarify expectations. Chen moved to the viewport, looking out at his damaged ship with an expression that Vexai couldn't quite read. You see, Commander, I think there might be some mutual benefit to our situation here. Explain. You're curious about us, about our technology and how we've managed to survive despite our obvious limitations. We're grateful for your help, but we're also aware that gratitude doesn't usually last long in situations like this. Chen turned back to face the massive alien. So I'm proposing a trade. Vexai leaned back in his chair, which creaked ominously under his weight. What could you possibly offer that would interest the Zephyrian Empire? Knowledge. Chen's voice was quiet but confident. You see, Commander, we humans have spent our entire evolutionary history dealing with things bigger, stronger, and more dangerous than ourselves. We've learned things that species like yours might never need to learn, but might find useful nonetheless. Such as how to find weaknesses in things that seem invulnerable. How to turn an opponent's strength against them. How to win fights that you can't possibly win through force alone. Chen paused, letting his words sink in. You mentioned that your empire has conquered 17 star systems. I'm curious, have you ever encountered serious resistance? The question caught Vexai off guard. What do you mean? I mean enemies who couldn't be defeated through conventional warfare. Opponents who were too elusive to pin down, too clever to outfight, too adaptable to predict. Chen's smile was small but knowing. Because if you continue expanding, Commander, you will encounter such enemies. And, when you do, you might find that all the armor in the galaxy won't be enough to protect you. Vexai found himself leaning forward despite his better judgment. You speak as if you have experience with such things. Every human does, Commander. We've been prey animals for most of our evolutionary history. We learned to survive by being smarter, more adaptable, and more creative than our predators. We learned that sometimes the best way to defeat an enemy isn't to destroy them, it's to make them defeat themselves. The Zephyrian commander studied the small human for a long moment, trying to decide if he was listening to wisdom or elaborate deception. And, you believe this knowledge would be valuable to us? I believe it's knowledge you'll need eventually, whether you get it from us or learn it the hard way through experience. Chen moved back to the viewport, his reflection ghost-like in the transparent aluminum. The galaxy is a big place, Commander. Sooner or later, you're going to run into something that can't be conquered through strength alone. Vexai's claws drummed against his armrest as he considered the implications. The human's words had an uncomfortable ring of truth to them. The Empire's expansion had indeed been relatively easy so far, facing only species that either submitted immediately or were crushed through superior firepower. But, the galaxy was vast, filled with countless civilizations they had yet to encounter. What would happen when they finally met an enemy that wouldn't be intimidated by their armor and weapons? What exactly are you proposing? He asked finally. A partnership of sorts. You help us repair our ship and continue our journey, and we share what we've learned about surviving in a hostile universe. Think of it as insurance. Knowledge you hope you'll never need, but will be grateful to have if the situation arises. The commander was quiet for several minutes, weighing options and possibilities. Finally, he spoke. You will remain aboard my vessel for the duration of your ship's repairs. During that time, you will demonstrate these techniques you claim to possess. If they prove as valuable as you suggest, we will discuss the terms of your departure. Chen's smile was genuine and relieved. Thank you, Commander. I think you'll find this arrangement more beneficial than you expect. As the human was escorted back to his quarters, Vexai found himself staring out at the damaged human ship with new eyes. These creatures had crossed interstellar space in what was essentially a fragile container held together by ingenuity and desperation. They had survived countless dangers and challenges that would have destroyed more physically capable species. Perhaps there really was more than one way to measure strength. But, the commander had no way of knowing that he had just agreed to learn lessons that would ultimately transform not just his understanding of warfare, but the very foundation of the Zephyrian Empire itself. Some knowledge, once gained, could never be forgotten. And some light touches, once applied, could bring down structures that had seemed unshakable for generations.
The demonstration began in Training Bay 7, the largest combat facility aboard the Iron Sovereign.
Vexhai had assembled his most trusted officers to witness what the humans claimed they could teach about warfare. The massive chamber echoed with the sound of armored footsteps as a dozen Zephyrian warriors took their positions around the central combat area. Captain Chen stood in the middle of the bay, looking impossibly small, surrounded by beings that could crush him without effort. He wore no armor, carried no weapons, and seemed completely unperturbed by the predatory gazes fixed upon him.
Dr.
Williams and Chief Rodriguez flanked him, equally vulnerable and equally calm. "This should be amusing," Lieutenant Kreshtar muttered to his neighbor, loud enough for the humans to hear.
What could these softskins possibly teach warriors who have conquered star systems?
Shen smiled at the insult, which only seemed to irritate the assembled Zephyrians further.
"Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the vast space despite its lack of the deep resonance that marked proper Zephyrian speech. "Before we begin, I'd like to establish some ground rules. First, no one gets permanently injured today.
Second, everything you see here is meant to illustrate principles that can be scaled up from personal combat to fleet engagement. And, third," his smile widened, "please don't let your preconceptions blind you to what you're actually seeing."
"Enough talk," growled combat instructor Threxanael, a scarred veteran whose armor bore the marks of 100 battles.
"Show us these techniques you claim are so valuable, or admit that you're wasting our time."
"Very well." Shen turned to Dr. Williams. "Sarah, would you mind helping me with the first demonstration?"
The human female stepped forward, and several Zephyrians actually laughed out loud.
Williams was even smaller than Shen, her frame delicate even by human standards. The idea that she could demonstrate anything related to combat was so absurd that even Vexhai found himself questioning the wisdom of this arrangement. "The first principle," Chen announced, "is that every defense has a weakness, no matter how perfect it appears. The key is understanding the difference between strength and rigidity." He gestured to Threxanael. "Instructor, would you be willing to participate in a small exercise? Nothing harmful, I assure you."
The combat veteran snorted with derision.
"Gladly, soft skin. What do you want me to do?"
"Simply stand there and maintain your normal defensive posture.
Don't move, don't react, just be as immovable as possible."
Threxanael planted his feet and crossed his massive arms, his armor plates locking into place with audible clicks. He looked like a statue carved from living stone, absolutely immovable and utterly confident.
"Now what, human? Now, Dr.
Williams is going to demonstrate why sometimes the smallest force, applied in exactly the right place, can have unexpected results." Williams approached the towering Zephyrian, her movements fluid and precise. She walked around him slowly, studying his posture with the intensity of a scientist examining a particularly interesting specimen. The watching warriors began to mutter among themselves, wondering what possible threat such a tiny creature could pose to one of their finest combat instructors.
"You see," Chen continued his narration, "Instructor Threxanael has adopted what he considers a perfect defensive position.
His armor is locked, his stance is stable, his center of gravity is low.
By conventional standards, he's essentially immovable."
Williams completed her circuit and positioned herself directly in front of the armored giant. She reached way up to place one small hand against a specific point on his chest armor.
"However," Chen said quietly, "perfection is often another word for predictability."
Williams pressed against the armor plate with what looked like the gentlest of touches.
For a moment, nothing happened.
Then, Threxanael's eyes widened in shock as he felt something give way beneath her fingers. There was a soft click, followed by a mechanical whirring sound, and, suddenly, the instructor was stumbling backward as his armor's locking mechanisms disengaged all at once. The massive warrior windmilled his arms frantically, trying to regain his balance as his carefully calibrated defensive posture collapsed into awkward flailing. He managed to keep from falling, but the damage to his dignity was complete. Every Zephyrian in the room stared in stunned silence as their elite combat instructor stood there with his armor hanging loose and his confidence shattered.
"How?"
Vexhai's voice was barely above a whisper. Williams smiled apologetically.
"I'm sorry, instructor.
I hope that wasn't too uncomfortable." Your armor's locking system has a manual override. It has to, for emergency medical situations. The override is hidden, but it's not invisible to someone who knows what to look for.
Chen nodded approvingly. Dr. Williams spent 15 minutes studying your armor while we talked.
She identified the override mechanism, calculated the exact pressure needed to activate it, and waited for the right moment to apply that pressure.
No strength required, just knowledge, observation, and precision.
Frexnal was frantically trying to re-engage his armor locks, his face flushed with embarrassment and growing anger.
Trickery, he snarled. Deception and sabotage, nothing more.
Exactly, Chen agreed cheerfully. Now imagine if instead of a manual pressure plate, Dr. Williams had been applying a precisely calibrated electromagnetic pulse to your armor's control systems. Or if she'd identified a resonance frequency that could cause catastrophic failure in your power core. Or if she'd simply observed your movement patterns long enough to predict exactly where you'd step and placed a small obstacle in precisely the right location.
The implications hit the assembled warriors like a physical blow.
They began looking at their own armor with new eyes, suddenly aware of systems and mechanisms they'd always taken for granted.
If their defensive equipment could be turned against them so easily, what other vulnerabilities might they be carrying into battle without even knowing it?
This is all very clever, HFY said slowly, but it only works if you have time to study your opponent beforehand. In real combat, Rodriguez interrupted, speaking for the first time, you don't need to study each individual enemy. You need to understand the principles that govern their design philosophy. The chief engineer moved to the center of the demonstration area, his movements confident despite his obvious physical limitations.
May I borrow one of your sidearms, Commander?
HFY hesitated, then drew his personal plasma pistol and handed it to the human.
The weapon looked enormous in Rodriguez's small hands, clearly designed for much larger users.
Several warriors shifted nervously, but Chen raised a calming hand.
Don't worry, he assured them. This isn't a hostage situation.
Rodriguez examined the weapon carefully, turning it over in his hands and studying its construction. Beautiful engineering, he murmured appreciatively.
Robust power source, efficient plasma generation, excellent heat dissipation. Built to last and built to kill. There's just one small problem.
Which is? HFY's voice carried a dangerous edge.
It's over-engineered for its intended purpose. Rodriguez set the weapon down on a nearby equipment crate and stepped back.
This pistol can probably fire continuously for hours without overheating. It can function in vacuum, underwater, in corrosive atmospheres, and extreme temperatures. It's virtually indestructible under normal circumstances. That sounds like a benefit, not a problem, Lieutenant Kreshtar observed.
Under normal circumstances, yes. But what happens when circumstances become abnormal?
Rodriguez smiled and pulled a small device from his pocket, something that looked like a modified scanner. This is a standard human emergency beacon, modified with about 10 minutes of spare parts from your workshop. He activated the device, and immediately every piece of electronic equipment in the training bay began emitting high-pitched whines and flashing error lights.
The Zephyrian warriors looked around in confusion as their armor systems started reporting malfunctions and their weapons began powering down unexpectedly. What are you doing? Frexnal demanded, his hand moving toward his backup weapon. Creating abnormal circumstances, Rodriguez replied calmly.
That beacon is now broadcasting on about 40 different frequencies simultaneously, including several that interfere with standard Zephyrian electronics. Your equipment is trying to compensate, but the interference is faster than your defensive systems can adapt. Sure enough, within moments the plasma pistol on the crate began flashing warning lights and emitting error beeps. Its systems, designed to resist interference, were working exactly as intended, but they were working so hard to maintain functionality that they were draining power at an exponential rate. Your weapon will be completely dead in about 3 minutes, Rodriguez announced. Not broken, not damaged, just empty. And, because your power cells are designed to be so robust and long-lasting, they can't be quickly recharged or replaced in field conditions. HFY stared at the small device in the human's hands with a mixture of fascination and horror. You're saying that our greatest strengths can become your greatest weaknesses? Yes.
Every design choice involves trade-offs. You chose durability over adaptability, power over efficiency, reliability over flexibility. Those are good choices under most circumstances, but they create predictable vulnerabilities that can be exploited by someone who understands the underlying principles. Shen rejoined the conversation. This is what I meant about turning strength against itself. We're not stronger than you, we're not even close. But we've learned to look for the structural weaknesses that strength creates. The beacon continued its electronic assault, and more equipment began failing around the training bay. Emergency lighting kicked in as the main illumination systems struggled with the interference. Several warriors were forced to manually override their armor systems as automated functions began glitching unpredictably. Enough, Vexhai commanded. Turn it off. Rodriguez complied immediately, and the beacon fell silent. Slowly, the various systems in the training bay began returning to normal operation, though several pieces of equipment continued displaying error messages and diagnostic warnings. The effect is temporary, Rodriguez assured them. Everything will be back to full functionality within a few minutes. But, in a combat situation. In a combat situation, a few minutes is a lifetime, Vexhai finished grimly. Show me more. Over the next several hours, the humans demonstrated principle after principle of what they called asymmetric warfare. They showed how communication protocols could be disrupted by broadcasting carefully crafted false signals. They demonstrated how formation tactics could be turned into liabilities through the use of psychological pressure and misdirection. They revealed ways to use an enemy's own sensor systems against them, feeding false information that would cause them to make tactical errors. Most disturbing of all, they showed how these techniques could be scaled up from individual combat to fleet engagement to strategic warfare. Every strength the Zephyrian Empire had relied upon for its expansion could potentially be turned into a weakness by an enemy who understood the right principles. This is all theoretical, Lieutenant Kreshtar protested as the demonstration continued. You're assuming that our enemies would have access to our equipment specifications, our communication protocols, our tactical doctrines, information that any species would inevitably acquire after a few encounters with your forces, Dr. Williams pointed out gently. You've conquered 17 systems, Commander. How many species have observed your methods and survived to pass on that knowledge? The silence that followed was pregnant with uncomfortable implications. The Zephyrian Empire's expansion strategy had always assumed that dead enemies couldn't share intelligence about Imperial tactics. But what about survivors? What about neutral observers? What about species that had submitted to Imperial rule but retained their own communication networks? You're suggesting that our very success has made us vulnerable, Vexhai said slowly. I'm suggesting that your success has been based on fighting enemies who didn't know how to exploit your weaknesses, Chen corrected. That situation won't last forever. Sooner or later, you'll encounter someone who's been watching, learning, and preparing. Someone like you, Threxenael accused, his hand moving to his weapon again. Someone like us, Chen agreed without rancor. Though we're more interested in avoiding that kind of conflict than engaging in it. Which brings us to the second major principle of human warfare strategy. Which is, sometimes the best way to win a war is to convince your enemy that fighting isn't worth the cost. Shen gestured to his two companions, and they began setting up another demonstration. You see, Commander, humans learned long ago that we can't win every fight through force. So we developed other approaches. Economic warfare. Psychological operations. Strategic deception. The art of making our enemies defeat themselves. Elaborate. Gladly. Dr. Williams, would you mind explaining the prisoner's dilemma scenario we discussed earlier? Williams stepped forward, her manner shifting to that of a university lecturer. The prisoner's dilemma is a classic example of game theory, the mathematical analysis of strategic decision-making. Two prisoners are arrested and held separately. Each is offered a deal, testify against the other prisoner, and receive a light sentence while the other receives a harsh one. If both testify, both receive moderate sentences. If neither testifies, both receive light sentences due to lack of evidence. Several Zephyrians looked confused by the abstract nature of the discussion. What does this have to do with warfare? Threxenael demanded. Everything, Chen replied. Because the optimal strategy depends not on what you want to do, but on what you believe your opponent will do. Change the information available to the players, and you change the outcome of the game. Rodriguez activated another device, this one projecting a holographic display showing a simplified tactical scenario. Imagine you're commanding a fleet that's outnumbered 3-1. Conventional wisdom says you should retreat, regroup, and wait for reinforcements. But what if you could convince the enemy that you're actually the larger force? The hologram showed two fleet formations, one clearly smaller than the other. False transponder signals make your ships appear more numerous. Decoy drones extend your apparent sensor profile. Carefully orchestrated communications suggest the presence of additional forces just outside sensor range. The enemy commander is now faced with uncertainty: are they outnumbered or not? If they believe they're outgunned, they might retreat, HFY mused. But if they discover the deception, then you've bought time to escape or receive actual reinforcements, Chen finished. But here's the beautiful part: even if they suspect deception, they can't be certain. Military commanders are trained to avoid unnecessary risks. Faced with ambiguous information, most will choose caution over aggression. Unless they're Zephyrian, Kreshtar said proudly. We do not retreat from inferior opponents. No, Williams agreed, but you do conduct reconnaissance before engaging unknown threats. You gather intelligence, assess capabilities, prepare contingency plans. All of which takes time your opponent can use to achieve their actual objectives. The holographic scenario shifted, showing how the seemingly weaker force could use the delay to accomplish various strategic goals while their enemies were busy preparing for a battle that would never come. This is cowardice, HFY declared. Deception and trickery instead of honest combat. This is survival, Chen corrected firmly. And it works because it's based on understanding how your opponents think, what they value, what they fear. You don't need to be stronger than your enemies if you can predict their behavior accurately enough to stay one step ahead. The demonstration continued for another 2 hours, covering concepts that most Zephyrians had never considered. Guerrilla tactics that turned an enemy's supply lines against them. Information warfare that corrupted decision-making processes. Economic strategies that made conquest more expensive than cooperation. By the time it was over, HFY found himself looking at warfare from a completely different perspective. The humans had shown him that strength without wisdom was merely brutality, and that brutality, while effective in the short term, created the very conditions that would eventually lead to its own downfall. These techniques, he said thoughtfully, they would be effective against imperial forces. They would be effective against any force that relies primarily on conventional superiority, Chen confirmed. Which is why we're sharing them with you. Because knowledge of these methods is the only reliable defense against them. You're arming us against ourselves, Dr. Williams added quietly. Teaching you to recognize your own vulnerabilities so you can address them before someone else exploits them. HFY considered this for a long moment. And, in return? Safe passage to continue our journey, Chen replied. And, perhaps, a different kind of relationship between our species. One based on mutual respect rather than predator and prey. The Zephyrian commander looked around at his officers, seeing his own thoughts reflected in their expressions. These humans had fundamentally changed how they understood conflict, strategy, and power. The implications would take time to fully process. Your ship will be repaired, he decided finally. And you will be provided with safe passage to whatever destination you choose. But first, I want you to speak with our strategic planning staff. There are questions that need answers. Of course, Commander. We're happy to help. As the humans were escorted to their next appointment, HFY remained in the empty training bay, staring at the equipment that had been so easily turned against itself. For the first time in his military career, he found himself wondering whether the Zephyrian Empire's greatest victories might actually have been the seeds of its eventual defeat. The touch had been light, almost gentle. But the foundations of his worldview had collapsed just as surely as HFY's armor locks. The Imperial War Council met in the ancient halls of Zephyros Prime, where the carved stone walls bore witness to 3 centuries of conquest and expansion. 37 of the Empire's most senior commanders sat around the massive obsidian table,
their armor gleaming under the harsh artificial lighting. At the head of the table, Supreme War Commander Thector Ironscale presided over what would later be remembered as the most contentious military gathering in Imperial history. "This ends now," Thector's voice boomed through the chamber with the authority of absolute power. "The so-called partnership experiments have gone too far. We are warriors, not merchants. We are conquerors, not negotiators." Admiral Korthax High, recently returned from the spectacularly successful Vorthan integration, found himself in the uncomfortable position of defending policies he'd once considered heretical. "Supreme Commander, with respect, the results speak for themselves. The Fourth Fleet has successfully integrated 6 new systems in the past year alone, with minimal resistance and maximum economic benefit. Through weakness," snarled General Vorthakmal, commander of the 1st Assault Legion. "Through capitulation and compromise. You've turned the mighty Zephyrian Empire into a trading consortium." "I've turned the Zephyrian Empire into a more efficient instrument of expansion," Korthax High replied evenly. "Systems that would have required years to subjugate and decades to pacify are now volunteering for Imperial partnership. Our military forces are free to focus on genuine threats rather than suppression operations." Commander Vexhai, who had started this entire chain of events by showing mercy to a damaged human ship, spoke up from his position at the table. "The Supreme Commander raises valid concerns. These new methods challenge fundamental aspects of Imperial identity. But, can we ignore their effectiveness?" Thector's golden eyes fixed on Vexhai with predatory intensity. "Commander, you were the first to encounter these humans. You were the first to be infected by their weakness worship. Perhaps you'd care to explain how creatures that can barely survive in vacuum manage to corrupt Imperial military doctrine?" The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Several commanders shifted uncomfortably in their seats, aware that they were witnessing a confrontation that could reshape the Empire's future direction. "They didn't corrupt anything, Supreme Commander. They revealed flaws that were already present in our approach." Vexhai's voice remained steady despite the implicit threat in his superior's tone. "Flaws that were costing us resources, time, and strategic opportunities." "What flaws?" General Vorthakmal demanded. "We have conquered 17 star systems without suffering a single major defeat. Our expansion has been unprecedented in galactic history." Admiral Korthax High activated the chamber's holographic display system, filling the space above the table with economic and strategic data. "Our expansion has been costly and inefficient. Look at these figures. Suppression operations in newly conquered systems tie up an average of 23% of our military assets. Infrastructure replacement due to resistance damage costs nearly 40% of initial resource extraction revenue. Administrative overhead for direct occupation averages numbers," Thector interrupted dismissively. "Accountants' concerns. We are not bookkeepers, Admiral. We are the instruments of Imperial destiny." "Imperial destiny requires Imperial resources," Korthax High shot back. "Resources that are being wasted on unnecessary conflicts with species that could be productive partners instead of resentful subjects." Commander Gexnal of the 2nd Conquest Fleet leaned forward, his scarred features skeptical. "These partnerships you speak of, how do we know they won't turn against us the moment they perceive weakness?" "Gratitude is a temporary emotion. Because their prosperity is tied to our prosperity," Admiral Korthax High explained, highlighting specific data points in the holographic display. "Partner species receive direct economic benefits from Imperial expansion. They have a vested interest in our continued success." "And what happens when those benefits are no longer sufficient? When they demand greater shares of profit, more autonomy, expanded rights?" General Vorthakmal's voice carried the harsh certainty of someone who believed he already knew the answers. "Appeasement breeds escalating demands." Vexhai found himself thinking of Captain Chen's words about turning strength against itself. Perhaps. But, consider the alternative, the slow drain of resources maintaining unwilling subjects who contribute only under the constant threat of force. Which approach actually strengthens the Empire? The debate raged for hours, touching on questions that went far beyond military strategy. What was the purpose of Imperial expansion? Was it conquest for its own sake, or the accumulation of power and wealth?
Could the Empire maintain its identity while adapting its methods? Were their principles so fundamental that abandoning them would destroy the very thing they were trying to preserve?
As the arguments continued, it became clear that the War Council was dividing into two distinct factions. The traditionalists, led by Supreme Commander Thector, insisted that imperial strength came from the fear and respect earned through overwhelming force. The pragmatists, increasingly rallying around Admiral Korthaxi, argued that imperial strength should be measured by results rather than methods. This philosophical debate is fascinating, Commander Drexai of the Fifth Fleet interjected during a brief lull in the arguments, but it's becoming academic. The humans' techniques are spreading beyond military applications. The statement brought immediate silence to the chamber.
Explain, Thector commanded.
Intelligence reports indicate that multiple species throughout Imperial space have begun studying human strategic methods. Not for military purposes necessarily, but for economic and social applications. The Nexari corporate guilds are experimenting with partnership models for resource development. The Thonish Collective is implementing what they call asymmetric negotiation tactics in trade disputes.
Admiral Korthaxi felt a chill of recognition.
The humans warned us this might happen.
Knowledge once shared becomes impossible to contain. Are you suggesting that these creatures deliberately spread their philosophies to destabilize imperial authority?
I'm suggesting they shared knowledge that we asked them to share, Vexai replied carefully.
The consequences are our responsibility, not theirs.
Commander Gexnal pulled up his own intelligence files, adding new data to the holographic display.
It's worse than simple adoption of human techniques. Multiple species are beginning to question the fundamental assumptions underlying imperial expansion policy.
The new data was disturbing. Across imperial space, subject species were analyzing the cost-benefit ratios of imperial rule versus independence. They were studying the economic models that made partnership more profitable than exploitation. Most concerning of all, they were sharing these analyses with each other through communication networks that imperial intelligence had previously considered harmless.
This is what comes of showing weakness, General Vortakmel declared triumphantly.
The moment we demonstrate that imperial authority can be negotiated, every inferior species begins to believe they deserve equal treatment. The moment we demonstrate that imperial authority can be practical and adaptable, we show strength rather than brittle rigidity, Admiral Korthaxi countered. The question is whether we want to lead this transformation or be dragged along by it. Supreme Commander Thector rose from his seat, his massive frame casting shadows across the holographic displays.
Enough.
This debate serves no purpose. The Empire's course is clear, we will return to the proven methods that built our dominion.
The partnership experiments will be discontinued. Military commanders will resume standard occupation protocols.
Supreme Commander, Vexai said quietly, that may no longer be possible. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop several degrees.
Explain. The hegemony of Keth has requested negotiations for voluntary integration into the Empire.
The Solaren Republic has offered a mutual defense pact with resource-sharing provisions. The Independent Worlds Coalition wants to discuss economic partnership agreements. Vexai's voice remained steady as he delivered news that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. 17 different species or political entities have initiated contact with Imperial diplomatic channels in the past 30 days alone.
The implications hit the assembled commanders like a physical blow.
For centuries, the Zephyrian Empire had expanded through conquest, facing resistance that had to be overcome through superior firepower. Now, species were volunteering to join, but only under the partnership models that the traditionalists wanted to abandon.
This is manipulation, General Vortakmel snarled.
These species are trying to dictate terms to the Empire. These species are offering to contribute to imperial growth without requiring military conquest, Admiral Korthaxi corrected.
They're offering to make us stronger without costing us anything.
At the price of our identity. At the price of inefficient methods. Supreme Commander Thector studied the strategic displays with growing unease.
The galaxy was changing around them, responding to possibilities that hadn't existed before human intervention.
The Empire could adapt to these changes, or it could be left behind by them. What do the humans recommend? He asked finally, the question clearly costing him considerable pride.
Admiral Korthax High exchanged glances with Commander Vex High.
They recommend that we choose our own path rather than having it chosen for us. That we decide what kind of empire we want to be, rather than simply reacting to external pressures.
And, what kind of empire do you believe we should be?
The question hung in the air for several long moments.
Finally, Vex High spoke. The strongest possible empire.
One that grows through attraction rather than coercion.
One that leads through example rather than intimidation.
One that adapts to changing circumstances rather than being broken by them. You're describing something that has never existed in galactic history, Commander Gexanael observed. An empire built on voluntary cooperation rather than subjugation. Which means we would be creating something unprecedented, Admiral Korthax High replied.
Something that could potentially outlast traditional conquest-based empires by centuries or millennia.
Supreme Commander Thector was silent for a long time, processing implications that stretched far beyond immediate military concerns.
Finally, he spoke. The humans who started this transformation, where are they now?
Their ship was repaired 6 months ago, Vex High reported. They departed for the Outer Rim territories, toward systems beyond current Imperial borders.
Spreading their philosophies to species we haven't encountered yet? Possibly.
Or simply continuing their original mission, establishing human colonies in unclaimed space. Thector's laugh was harsh and, without humor.
Unclaimed space that may no longer be unclaimed by the time we reach it.
Space that may be occupied by species who have already learned to turn our own strengths against us.
The realization that human teachings might be creating future enemies was sobering for every commander present.
The galaxy was vast, filled with thousands of species that the Empire had not yet encountered. If those species were learning asymmetric warfare techniques before making contact with Imperial forces.
Recommendation, Supreme Commander? Admiral Korthax High asked formally. Adaptation, Thector replied grimly.
Not because I believe it's right, but because the alternative may be extinction.
The galaxy has changed, whether we like it or not.
We can change with it, or we can be destroyed by it.
And the partnership programs? Will be expanded and systematized.
If other species are going to learn these techniques anyway, we need to ensure that cooperation with the Empire remains more attractive than opposition to it.
General Vortekmal's objection was swift and angry. This is surrender to alien manipulation. This is adaptation to altered circumstances, Thector corrected with finality. The strong survive by changing when change is necessary.
The weak cling to outdated methods until they are swept away by those who adapted faster.
As the War Council disbanded and commanders returned to their fleets, the transformation of the Zephyrian Empire entered a new phase.
Within a year, voluntary integration would become the primary method of expansion. Within 5 years, the Empire would encompass over 100 systems, most acquired through partnership agreements rather than military conquest. But, the greatest changes were philosophical rather than territorial. The Empire had learned that strength could take many forms, that power could be multiplied through cooperation rather than hoarded through domination. They had learned, in other words, that sometimes the lightest touch could reshape the galaxy itself. The humans had moved on, carrying their knowledge to distant stars and unknown species. But, the ripples of their brief contact with the Zephyrian Empire would spread for generations, transforming not just one civilization but the fundamental nature of interstellar relations throughout the known galaxy.
Some touches, once made, could never be undone.
25 years had passed since the damaged human colony ship New Horizon had limped into Zephyrian space, but Commander Vex High, now Fleet Admiral Vex High Thornscale, still remembered every detail of that first encounter. Standing on the observation deck of his flagship Eternal Wisdom, he watched as the newest addition to the Zephyrian Commonwealth prepared for its integration ceremony.
The Commonwealth. Even now, the name felt strange on his forked tongue.
The Zephyrian Empire had officially ceased to exist 15 years earlier, transformed through gradual evolution into something unprecedented in galactic history, a voluntary association of over 300 species spanning nearly 2,000 star systems. What had begun as a desperate experiment to solve the Vorthan resistance problem had become the largest peaceful confederation in known space. Admiral, his current second-in-command, Commander Ythera of the Nexari species, approached with the latest integration reports. The fact that his deputy was not Zephyrian would have been unthinkable under the old empire, but the Commonwealth had learned that diversity of thought and experience was more valuable than species uniformity.
Status report, Commander? The Hellion Syndicate has completed their transition protocols. Their industrial capacity will be fully integrated into the Commonwealth Economic Network within 30 standard days.
Their scientific database has already yielded 14 new research opportunities, including potential advances in faster-than-light communication.
Admiral Vexhai nodded approvingly.
The Helians had initially been approached for traditional conquest 20 years earlier, but the Commonwealth's diplomatic corps had convinced them that voluntary partnership would be more beneficial for all parties. The negotiations had taken 3 years to complete, but the results vindicated the patient approach. The Helians were contributing more to Commonwealth strength as enthusiastic partners than they ever could have as reluctant subjects.
Any word from the frontier expeditions? Commander Ythera's expression grew thoughtful. That's interesting news, Admiral. The 47th Exploration Fleet has made contact with a previously unknown civilization in the Andorian cluster. Initial reports suggest they're technologically sophisticated and politically unified. Hostile? Cautious.
They've agreed to formal diplomatic contact, but they've also made it clear that they're prepared for military conflict if necessary.
Ythera paused, consulting her datapad. Admiral, they've specifically requested to meet with human representatives.
Vexhai felt his pulse quicken.
Humans? Are you certain?
Absolutely. They claim to have had previous contact with human explorers and want to include human advisors in any negotiations with the Commonwealth.
The implications were staggering.
For 25 years, the Commonwealth had been expanding outward from the original Zephyrian territories, encountering hundreds of new species and civilizations. But, in all that time, they had never again encountered humans directly. There had been rumors, scattered reports of human colonies in distant systems, but nothing confirmed. "Prepare my personal transport," Admiral Vexhai commanded.
"I want to meet these people personally." "Admiral, that's highly irregular. First contact protocols are suggestions, Commander, not absolute laws."
Besides, he added with a slight smile, "I have experience with humans that might prove valuable." The journey to the Andorian cluster took 8 days, even with the Commonwealth's most advanced faster-than-light drives. During the voyage, Admiral Vexhai studied everything available about the new civilization, the Andorian Collective, a federation of 12 species that had achieved interstellar unity nearly a century earlier. Their technology was impressive, their military capabilities formidable, and their diplomatic history suggested they were neither aggressive expansionists nor naive isolationists. Most intriguingly, they claimed that human advisors had been instrumental in their development of advanced defensive systems and strategic doctrines. If true, it meant that human influence had been spreading throughout the galaxy for decades, touching civilizations that the Commonwealth had never encountered.
The meeting took place aboard a neutral space station at the edge of collective territory.
Admiral Vexhai arrived with a small diplomatic team, while the Andorians brought a delegation representing all 12 of their member species. The diversity was remarkable: silicon-based crystalline beings, gaseous entities that existed in specialized containment fields, aquatic species requiring mobile ocean environments, and others that challenged conventional definitions of life itself. But it was the human representative that captured Vexhai's attention immediately. Captain Sarah Chen, the daughter of Marcus Chen, he learned later, stood beside the Andorian delegation with the calm confidence that seemed to be a universal human trait. She was taller than her father had been, with the kind of lean build that suggested a lifetime in variable gravity environments, but her eyes held the same intelligent curiosity that had characterized their first encounter with humanity decades earlier. "Admiral Vexhai," she said, stepping forward with that familiar human gesture of extending her hand in greeting.
"My father told me stories about you. It's an honor to finally meet the Zephyrian who helped change the galaxy." "The honor is mine, Captain Chen. Your father's influence on the Commonwealth cannot be overstated."
Vexhai carefully accepted the handshake, still marveling at the delicate strength of human hands.
"I must ask, how many other civilizations have encountered your people?" Sarah's smile was knowing. "More than you might expect, Admiral.
Humans have a tendency to wander, and our ships are small enough to slip through territories that larger civilizations might overlook. We've been making friends throughout this region of the galaxy for quite some time. The formal negotiations began an hour later, but Admiral Vexhai found himself more interested in the informal conversations that took place during breaks. Sarah Chen proved to be as insightful as her father, with additional decades of experience in interspecies diplomacy and strategic analysis. The collective is nervous about Commonwealth expansion, she explained during one such break. Not because they fear conquest, your reputation for partnership has spread even this far. They're concerned about losing their identity in something so much larger than themselves. A reasonable concern, Vexhai acknowledged. How do you recommend we address it? The same way my father would have recommended, I imagine. Show them that joining something larger can make them stronger rather than smaller. Demonstrate that the Commonwealth's strength comes from its diversity, not despite it. Over the following days, the negotiations proceeded smoothly. The Andorian collective agreed to a limited partnership arrangement, shared scientific research, mutual defense cooperation, and expanded trade relationships, but maintaining full political autonomy. It was exactly the kind of flexible agreement that had become the Commonwealth's trademark approach. But the real revelation came during a private dinner that Sarah Chen hosted for the Commonwealth delegation. Admiral, she said as the evening wound down, there's something you should know about human expansion patterns. We haven't been wandering randomly through the galaxy. Explain. We've been following the ripples. Sarah activated a portable holographic display, showing a three-dimensional map of known space. Every civilization that learned strategic principles from my father or other human explorers created ripples of change. Those ripples spread to neighboring systems, influenced trade relationships, altered diplomatic approaches. The map showed a complex web of connections spreading outward from the original Commonwealth territories. Civilizations that had never encountered humans directly had still been influenced by human ideas through secondary and tertiary contacts. You're saying that human strategic philosophy has been spreading throughout the galaxy for decades? I'm saying that human strategic philosophy has been evolving throughout the galaxy for decades, Sarah corrected. Each species that encounters these ideas adapts them to their own needs and circumstances. The collective's defensive doctrines, for example, are based on asymmetric principles that can be traced back to human influence, but they've been modified and improved through collective innovation. Admiral Vexhai studied the holographic map with growing awe. The Commonwealth's expansion had been impressive, but this suggested something far more significant: a gradual transformation of interstellar civilization itself, spreading through contact networks too complex for any single organization to control or direct. How many species have been influenced by these ripple effects? Conservative estimate? Several thousand. Actual number? Probably impossible to calculate. Sarah's expression grew serious. Admiral, the galaxy you're expanding into isn't the same galaxy that existed when your empire began its conquests. The rules have changed, the players have adapted, and the strategies that worked a generation ago may not work anymore. Are you warning us about future conflicts? I'm warning you about future opportunities. And responsibilities. Sarah manipulated the holographic controls, zooming in on regions beyond current Commonwealth borders. There are civilizations out there that have spent decades preparing for contact with major galactic powers. They've studied the Commonwealth's methods, analyzed your strengths and weaknesses, and developed their own approaches to interstellar relations. Hostile approaches? Adaptive approaches. Some might be hostile, others might be eager for partnership, most will probably be somewhere in between. But all of them will be prepared in ways that earlier civilizations weren't. The implications were both exciting and sobering. The Commonwealth had grown accustomed to being the most sophisticated diplomatic and strategic entity in any given encounter. But if human influence had been spreading for decades, creating a galaxy full of civilizations that understood asymmetric thinking and partnership strategies, what do you recommend? Admiral Vexhai asked finally. Keep learning. Keep adapting. Keep remembering that strength isn't about being the biggest or the toughest, it's about being the most flexible and creative. Sarah smiled, and, for a moment, she looked exactly like her father. And remember that sometimes the best way to stay ahead of the competition is to help them succeed too. The meeting concluded with agreements for expanded cooperation and regular diplomatic contact. But, as Admiral Vexai's ship began its journey back to Commonwealth space, he found himself contemplating changes that went far beyond formal treaties. His personal log entry that evening captured thoughts that would later be considered prophetic. "Today I met the daughter of the human who changed the course of Zephyrian history. In doing so, I realized that the changes he initiated were far more profound than we ever imagined. We thought we were adapting to human strategic philosophy, but we were actually participating in a galaxy-wide transformation of interstellar civilization itself. The Commonwealth has grown strong through flexibility and cooperation, but we are not unique in learning these lessons. The galaxy is full of species that have discovered their own versions of the principles Marcus Chen taught us decades ago. Our expansion will no longer be into a universe of inferior civilizations that can be easily conquered or convinced to join us. We will be expanding into a community of equals, each bringing their own innovations and improvements to the fundamental concepts of asymmetric strategy and partnership-based growth. This is both the greatest opportunity and the greatest challenge in Commonwealth history. We must prove ourselves worthy of leadership not through superior force, but through superior wisdom. We must demonstrate that our version of cooperative civilization is more attractive and effective than the alternatives being developed by other galactic powers. The human touch that collapsed our armor 25 years ago has become a light that continues to spread throughout the stars. It illuminates possibilities we never imagined and challenges we never anticipated. Our strength will be measured not by how well we can impose our will on others, but by how effectively we can work with others to achieve mutual prosperity and security. The galaxy Marcus Chen helped create is still becoming. Our role is to ensure that what it becomes serves the cause of peace and progress for all species fortunate enough to call the stars their home. Years later, when historians studied the transformation of interstellar civilization during what they would call the Great Awakening, they would identify Admiral Vexai's log entry as one of the first recognition that the age of conquest-based expansion was truly ending. The Commonwealth would continue to grow, but as the senior partner in an increasingly sophisticated community of equals rather than as a dominant empire ruling over subjects. The human colony ship New Horizon had completed its original mission decades earlier, establishing thriving human settlements in the Outer Rim territories. Its crew had lived full lives, raised families, and passed into the peaceful rest that comes to all mortal beings. But the knowledge they had shared, freely given in a moment of desperate gratitude, continued to spread and evolve throughout the galaxy. Sometimes the smallest gesture, made with the lightest touch, can reshape entire civilizations. Sometimes the most profound strength comes from knowing when not to use strength at all. And sometimes, in the vast darkness between the stars, the gentlest light can illuminate possibilities that no amount of force could ever create. The Commonwealth expanded not through conquest, but through attraction. Species joined not from fear, but from hope. And, throughout the galaxy, civilizations that had never heard the name human discovered for themselves the revolutionary idea that weakness could become strength, that flexibility could overcome rigidity, and that cooperation could achieve what domination never could. The armor had collapsed, as armor always must when touched in just the right way by just the right force applied at just the right moment. But what remained was something far stronger than any armor could ever be: the unbreakable bonds of mutual respect, shared prosperity, and common purpose that held the stars themselves together in their eternal dance through the cosmos. The light touch had been enough. It always was.